Hello, Lou Hamilton from Audible Elegance here in Cincinnati, Ohio. I am recording from home today in Virginia. And it's nice to be able to do so. My wife spent a month in the Cleveland Clinic, and she's back home now for a little bit. And she's doing the recording, so thank you very much, Loves. We do work on Facebook, Instagram, and X, and I write a monthly blog. Today I would like to talk about the difference between what I would call audiophiles and musicians when it comes to recordings. And this first became apparent to me with various performers of classical music. And some which had retired, some which were still active in the Cincinnati Symphony. And while audiophiles look for a number of different characteristics, including an elusive thing called image, musicians are not that way. They're actually listening to the performance itself, particularly where they sit or have played in the orchestra. So one of the aspects that happens with musicians when they're trying to evaluate not only the equipment but the recordings is they have a tendency to prefer a sort of sound which is consistent with where they sit in the orchestra or where they play in the band, I suppose. It's a balance question, so to speak, that they have a reference to. This also shows up in a second way in the recordings themselves, particularly classical. I had one former symphony performer from Europe, it wasn't Cincinnati Symphony, who essentially would only own or listen to recordings from Deutsche Grammophon. And you have to understand that there was a big difference in the way that Deutsche Grammophon does recordings and that of, let's say, London or Mercury. London is notorious for using a tri-mic system where the microphones are somewhat out in the audience area. They might be 20, 30, 40 feet away from the stage. And that is giving you the perspective and balance of what someone would hear in those locations. And with a tri-mic, you would be fairly close to developing, with proper techniques, a sense of spatial image. On the other hand, Deutsche Grammophon wanted to capture the pure essence of the instrument itself as it was being played. So it was not uncommon for them to use 50, 60, 70, maybe upwards to 100 microphones throughout an orchestra, with the microphones positioned very close to the instrument itself. Now, this gave the advantage of a level of detail of the actual playing of the instrument, performance of it, unlike a tri-mic system, which was at some distance where it was more of a blend. And so there are some musicians who prefer, particularly if they played in a particular section, catching all of the nuances of the performer doing their work in the orchestra. And Deutsche Grammophon was extraordinary at that. I've owned Deutsche Grammophon recordings, and I've loved them. But the detail level is very different. And when you have that number of microphones, to argue about that this system plays that stereo image right or that system doesn't play it right is rather foolish, because with that number of microphones, whatever is developed in terms of a stereo effect is really the work of the recording engineer. It's a creation, so to speak. It's not something that exists naturally. And there simply are no guidebooks given with any recording that explains what the intent or what the recording engineer did to create that sort of panorama. So musicians are very different in what they look for in a system as opposed to an audiophile. Now, I will be the first to say that, because I've had musicians in the store listening to recordings of them and their observations of what they were hearing. And quite sincerely, they're very much into the musical aspect of the recording. The rhythm, proper pitch consistency. If there's vocals, the emotional characteristics that were coming across from the singer, were the words understandable, things like that. They were looking at the pure performance aspects as opposed to the panorama of image, or that it had a consistent tonality that they thought was proper. Which, by the way, if anybody took the time to get, I think it was Audiophiles test CD number 3, they actually play around with different microphones, and the tonal effect was dramatic. So very few recordings have even telling you what microphones they use. So again, judging by pure tonality can be a very misleading thing, particularly once you have a mixing console and equalization even at the pressing plant. So musicians look at the actual musical performance. I think they can be very valuable in helping you select equipment from the aspect that they're looking at the performance itself, and whether things are occurring properly as they should. And classical music is complex. There's only some pieces that are consistent in tempo throughout. I think it was Haydn's Clock Symphony is a good example of one where the tempo is very consistent. But otherwise, things can change around a bit, and making it hard to understand what's happening musically, unless you're familiar with it. The thing where musicians can be somewhat of a hindrance in selecting equipment is that they're truly gifted with the ability to play music and the ability to play it without having anything in front of them. They don't need instructions. They can do it. And this means that the structure of the music and what should be happening is already buried in their head. And so when they hear something, they're already thinking forward ahead as to where it should be and what's going on. Particularly if they're very familiar with the music, they're not quite judging it the same way as if they were hearing, let's say, a street musician for the first time and evaluating whether they were any good or not. So one has to be a little careful. Musicians can be very helpful in understanding what's happening musically, letting them hear music that they are unfamiliar with, I think is an important aspect to take full advantage of their talent. Again, keep in mind that some of them will have a perspective of where they are in a musical group, because that's the tonality that they're accustomed to. So they're very different than audiophiles. I enjoy them immensely because of what they look for. Funny enough, I had a couple ask me to come over, this was years ago, to fix their system because one speaker wasn't playing. And all that had happened is their pet had managed to pull the wire off the terminal, and I hooked it back up, and we listened to it for a couple of minutes. And then I looked over at the preamplifier, which they hadn't touched other than the volume control for probably 15 or 20 years. And here it was set in mono. And they had enjoyed it in mono all those years. I flipped it to stereo, and they were amazed at how it sounded different. But they were listening to the music itself, and that the stereo effect was not as important as the performance. So they were a delightful couple. I enjoyed meeting them. Both were members of the symphony. So musicians think differently. They look for things a little different. And I think in many ways they do a lot of things very, very right. But keep in mind that they also come with a little baggage of how they view things. And I brought this subject up because I've had a couple people comment about how they rely upon musicians to help them select equipment. And I think that's important because they're listening to the music as opposed to being fascinated with the color of the knobs or its, curved front or whatever. But at the same time, they come with a little special baggage, and I'll just call it at that. So there is a difference between audiophiles and musicians, and we get the best out of any, play unfamiliar music, and make your evaluations from that. So there we are. Have fun with that info.